Late 1873, three of the most famous men on the American frontier walked into a theater stage together. Buffalo Bill Cody had served in the Union Army. Wild Bill, he had worked for the Union as a scout, a courier, and a detective. Standing beside them was old Texas Jack Omohundro. He's a former Confederate cavalryman who had ridden with the 5th Virginia Cavalry and served around Jeb Stuart's command. Less than a decade earlier, those men had belonged to opposing sides in the bloodiest war in American history. Now, they're torn together in a production called Scouts of the Plains, playing heroic versions of themselves before audiences eager to see what the Wild West looked like. The show offered danger, gunfire, frontier adventure, carefully polished legends, but the men on stage representing something much bigger. They showed how quickly the Civil War generation had moved west and assumed new identities.
All right.
Former soldiers became scouts, guerrillas became outlaws, veterans became lawmen, gunfighters, cowboys, and entertainers. Some carried military training and horsemanship with them. Others, they just carried political hatred, family grudges, and a willingness to settle problems with sudden violence with a gun.
Yeah.
Civil War didn't invent the American frontier, obviously, and didn't create every conflict that followed. But what it did was release an enormous generation of armed, experienced, and often displaced men into a rapidly changing West. Appomattox ended the armies, but didn't erase what those men had learned, what they believed, or what they're willing to do. The war was over. The men, the guns, and the grudges, they're still moving.
Yeah. I mean, how many times, like in the movies, or if you ever read a book or anything, that's the most famous line ever. The war is over. Why are you still like this? It may be over for you, but not for me.
Right. You didn't see what I saw.
Right. Yep. The Civil War, the battle between brothers, it did not create the American frontier. People, they've been crossing the plains, searching for gold, raising cattle, trading with native nations, and settling western land long before the first shots were ever fired at Fort Sumter. What the war did was change the number and the type of people moving west, what they brought with them, and the power of the federal government moving alongside them. By the year of 1865, millions of Union and Confederate veterans had passed through military service. These were men who had learned how to ride, how to shoot, how to scout unfamiliar country, carry messages, guard supply lines, track an enemy, and survive for long periods of time away from home. They had spent years surrounded by sudden death, chaos. Anything could happen at any moment. And that did not mean every veteran came home eager to kill again. And most never became outlaws or gunfighters or never even touched a gun again. But the country now contained an enormous number of young men with military experience, and many of them struggle to return to the lives they have known before the war. For former Rebs, those lives sometimes no longer existed.
Yeah.
Farms were destroyed, towns that they lived in were damaged, local economies shattered, families broken apart. Slavery, thing of the past. That was the foundation of the Southern economy. That's what they were trying to defend, something like that. And it was gone. Some stayed and some tried. They tried to rebuild. What are you going to do? This is your home, right? Others, they went west. They crossed into Mexico. Or they looked anywhere they might find land, work, or the chance to begin again without living under the immediate weight of defeat. Yeah, they were embarrassed, ashamed.
Yeah.
They entered a country filled with weapons left over from 4 years of mass warfare. Revolvers, rifled muskets, carbines, repeating rifles. All this that had been purchased or manufactured for armies did not simply disappear when the soldiers went home. Well, they just poof went in midair. Didn't need those anymore.
War's over.
Men also carry their own guns, their own saddles, their own military habits, and their own boots, and wartime connections into civilian life as well. And at that very same time, the old federal government had grown larger, richer, and more capable of extending its authority across the continent. What do you want? Big Brother coming in. Even while the war was being fought, Congress passed the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act in 1862. This opened the western land to settlement and supporting construction of a transcontinental railroad.
That's what Lincoln was trying to get done before he got a bullet to the head.
When the railroad was completed in 1869, people, livestock, weapons, supplies, and information could all move across the country faster than ever before. The Army maintained and expanded forts all across the West, protected travel routes, guarded railroad crews and mail service, and launched campaigns against native peoples standing in the path of settlement.
Let's not fucking frame it as they launched.
All right, and they're standing in the path of settlement. No, these motherfuckers been living there for 120 years.
Right.
They weren't standing in the path. They were just pooping or something.
Right. They were just sitting there.
This created jobs especially suited to former soldiers. Veterans became scouts, teamsters, contractors, railroad guards, marshals, deputies, and even regular Army soldiers.
I went back or stayed.
And for black veterans and other black men seeking new opportunities after emancipation, the post-war Army offered a path into the Western regiments that became known as the Buffalo Soldiers.
The Buffalo Soldiers.
For other veterans, Western employment allowed military life to continue under a different name. They're still riding armed through dangerous country, following orders, protecting supplies, tracking enemies, and relying on the men beside them. Civil War did not invent Western migration or Western violence. It accelerated it, though. It sent trained and displaced people into the region while giving the federal government more power than it ever had to move with them. Nowhere was the line between wartime violence and an emerging Wild West thinner than in Missouri and Kansas. And for some men, the Civil War never truly ended at all.
Like we said, the clearest connection was in Missouri and Kansas, where the fighting had already started years before Fort Sumter popped off. During the 1850s, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers, they poured into Kansas territory, hoping to decide whether Kansas would enter the Union as a free state or a slave state. Elections, they were corrupted, homes were burned, towns were attacked. Men, they were murdered in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. Armed groups crossed the border in both directions. Pro-slavery Missourians, they tried to control Kansas politics, while anti-slavery Jayhawkers, they raided into Missouri.
Right.
Sometimes freeing enslaved people, but also stealing property, burning homes, and attacking civilians. By the time the old war began in 1861, people in this region, they were already accustomed to settling political arguments with old gunfire.
Yep.
Missouri, they remained in the Union, but its population was deeply divided. We know that. They had like two governments.
Right.
Some men joined the Union Army or loyal militia. Others entered the Missouri State Guard, Confederate units, or the guerrilla bands. In many communities, the enemy was not some unknown soldier from another state either. It was a neighbor. It was a former friend, Billy, down the road.
Right.
Or just a rival family living a few miles away.
You broke bread with us.
And we all know the name William Quantrill. He became one of the most famous of the Confederate guerrilla leaders operating inside Missouri.
Him and his fucking raiders.
Right. His men, they didn't fight like a regular army holding the ground in large formations. They didn't have to. They could call them raiders for a reason.
Right.
They traveled in small mounted bands, blended back into friendly communities, gathered info from relatives and supporters, and attacked when they had the advantage. Some rebel partisan ragers, they were officially organized and expected to operate under military authority. But bushwhackers such as old Quantrill and his men, they occupied a far less certain position. They claimed to be Confederate soldiers and sometimes cooperated with Confederate commands. But they usually operated outside the control and discipline of the regular army. Union authorities generally treated them as criminals who were not entitled to the protections given captured soldiers either. They'll execute you on the spot, boy.
Right.
That only made surrender less likely and retaliation more brutal.
Yeah.
Quantrill's attack on Lawrence, Kansas, brutal one, August 21st, 1863, showed just how far the border war had fallen. Lawrence was anti-slavery and was a stronghold with deep connections to the Jayhawkers. They had raided recently into western Missouri. Quantrill, several hundred guerrillas, they entered the town around dawn, burned homes, businesses, looted stores and banks, and killed about 150 men and boys.
Right.
The raid was presented as revenge for the Union attacks in Missouri and the deaths of female relatives of guerrillas after the collapse of the Kansas City prison. Well, whatever the reasons raiders offered, Lawrence became a massacre of largely defenseless civilians. Union retaliation, it followed. General Thomas Ewing, he issued General Order Number 11, forcing most residents out of 4 counties along Missouri's western borders.
That was a bold move.
Right. Even families loyal to the Union were ordered away from rural homes and required to relocate near military posts.
Basically, martial law, but without the government doing it.
Farms, they were abandoned or burned. Crops were destroyed. Large sections of the countryside were nearly emptied.
Damn.
The government hoped that removing civilians would take away the shelter, food, and info sustaining the guerrillas.
Nope.
Instead, all that did was displace thousands of people and added another layer of bitterness to a war already driven by personal loss.
Damn right.
But by 1864, William Bloody Bill Anderson, he had become one of the most feared guerrilla leaders in Missouri himself. September 27th, his men stopped a train near Centralia, robbed its passengers, pulled unarmed, injured Union soldiers aboard from their cars. The guerrillas killed more than 20 of them.
I think we did this, didn't we?
Stood them up in a row and smoked them all.
Ridiculous.
And they rode away carrying their uniforms and weapons.
Wow.
Later that day, a mounted Union force pursued Anderson and walked into a carefully prepared trap.
Oh, shit.
The guerrillas broke the Union line at close range and killed well over 100 men during the battle in pursuit.
Damn.
Centralia, combined deception, surprise, overwhelming violence, and the destruction of an enemy caught outside support and distance.
Well, plus, too, the Union Army is used to, like, fighting another army, and the guerrillas, there's no laws or...
They're not setting up formations and doing that shit.
There's no war powers or ethics or anything. These motherfuckers.
Civilians suffered throughout the struggle, regardless of allegiance. Confederate guerrillas murdered Union supporters and suspected informants. Union militia and Jayhawkers burned property, drove families from their homes, sometimes treated any civilian who aided the guerrillas as an enemy.
Yeah.
Robbery could be called confiscation. Murdery could be called retaliation. A private feud could be folded into the larger war until no one could clearly separate politics, military necessity, revenge, and personal profit.
Right, all the same.
The old guerrillas, they learned just how much a small group of armed horsemen could accomplish by choosing the time and place of an attack. They learned to use sympathetic families as a supply system, local gossip as intelligence, disguises to confuse pursuers, threats to silence witnesses, and scattered routes to disappear before regular troops could respond. When that war ended, those methods didn't suddenly become useless. They were nearly identical to the methods later used by Western outlaw gangs who were robbing banks, trains, and stagecoaches. Among those young men shaped by this border war were none other than Frank James, Jesse James, and Cole Younger.
Look at that.
Before Americans knew their names as outlaws, they had learned to fight in a place where the difference between soldier and criminal, well, we don't even know. The line's so blurred.
Mm-hmm. Frank James, 18 years old. Civil War began. Old enough to choose a side immediately. May 4th, 1861, he joined a pro-Confederate unit that became part of the Missouri State Guard under General Sterling Price. And that very August, Frank fought at Wilson's Creek. This is where the Missouri State Guard and Confederate troops defeated a smaller Union army outside of Springfield. It was a kind of conventional battle most people associate with the Civil War. But Frank's time in that version of the conflict did not last long. He became sick. Reportedly, measles.
He got the measles.
He was left behind as Confederates forces, they withdrew. Union troops captured him, released him on parole, and allowed him to return home after he promised not to take up arms again.
Stupidest thing in the world.
No, Frank, he was one of those liars. He did not keep that promise. With regular Confederate control of the Missouri collapsing, he entered the guerrilla war taking its place. He rode with the Clay County Band, led by Fernando Scott, and later became associated with William Quantrill's guerrillas. Frank, he's generally believed to have participated in Quantrill's attack on Lawrence in August of 1863. Although separating his exact actions from later claims is very difficult. He then followed Quantrill's men to Texas before returning to Missouri and eventually riding with William Bloody Bill Anderson. By this point, Frank had moved far away from armies meeting openly on battlefields. He was now part of a hidden war built around ambushes, raids, local informants, family connections, and retaliation. Oh, Jesse James. He was about 13 when the war began. He was too young to enlist, but it did not keep the conflict away from him, though.
They didn't give a shit. Be a drummer boy.
Frank's activities made James Farm a target for Union militia searching for guerrillas and the civilians supporting them. 1863, militiamen came looking for Frank and his companions. Jesse, he was questioned and reportedly beaten when he refused to reveal what he knew. His stepdaddy, Reuben Samuel, you can't trust that guy.
Right. 2 first names. Never can.
He was briefly hanged from a tree in an effort to force information from him. Later, writers turned this incident into one of the defining moments of Jesse's life, sometimes adding dramatic details that cannot be confirmed.
That's what writers do.
Yep. But what is clear is that the war had entered his home and made his family part of that struggle. In the spring of 1864, approximately 16 years old, Jesse, he joined a guerrilla band led by Fletch Taylor. This is where he rode alongside Frank. After Taylor lost an arm from a shotgun wound, the brothers became connected with Bloody Bill Anderson's command, one of the most violent guerrilla bands operating in all of Mizzou. Jesse, he was badly wounded in the chest during fighting that summer, but he recovered and returned to the guerrillas. On the 27th of September, Anderson's men entered Centralia.
Yeah, we know.
They did that train robbery. Frank later claimed that Jesse personally killed Major Johnson, but that story appeared years afterward and cannot be independently proven. This is the problem surrounding much of James Brothers' wartime history. They unquestionably rode with Confederate guerrillas and participated in various conflicts, vicious ones as that. But former guerrillas, family members, newspaper writers, and later admirers repeatedly enlarged individual exploits until documented history became tangled with legend. That's usually how it goes, man. It's like the telephone game.
All right.
After Anderson was moited in October of 1864, the brothers followed a different guerrilla leaders. Frank, he eventually went into Kentucky with Quantrill. Jesse remained connected to Archie Clement, one of Anderson's former lieutenants. In the spring of 1865, the war is coming to an end. The Confederacy is collapsing. Jesse and other guerrillas encountered Union cavalry near Lexington, Missouri. According to the account that became accepted afterward, Jesse approached under a white flag. He was intending to surrender, but he was shot through the chest by a Union cavalryman. The bullet passed through his lung, leaving him with another wound that nearly killed him. The precise circumstances are difficult to establish, but the shooting itself is not seriously disputed. Jesse, he survived. He spent months recovering while his family cared for him. And by the time the war ended, Frank, he was 22. Jesse was just a mere 17 years old with 2 bullet wounds. Yet both had already lived inside a world where armed men survived through secrecy, speed, intimidation, loyalty, and support from sympathetic families. Guerrilla warfare, it didn't interrupt otherwise peaceful lives before allowing them to return to normal. For Jesse, it had been his education. That's how he learned. He's a street smart boy. The brothers carried Confederate loyalty, family grievances, local support networks, the methods of the Bushwhacker War into the years that followed. When they later rode in the small groups, struck without warning, escaped through familiar country, and depended on friends to hide them, they were not inventing a new way of operating. The war, it's officially over. But Frank and Jesse, they already knew how to continue living like guerrillas.
You sure did. Well, Cole Younger's path in being an outlaw began in the same Missouri border war that shaped Frank and Jesse. He was born into a wealthy slave-holding family in Jackson County, Missouri. Cole, he was still a teenager when the war tore his family apart. His daddy, Henry Washington Younger, he supported the Union, but he was murdered in 1862, reportedly by members of a pro-Union militia.
Oh, wow.
Pro-Union, huh?
Wow.
Cole believed Captain Wally Baines was responsible and later claimed he killed Baines in revenge, although that can't be proven.
Right.
His sister, Henrietta, was imprisoned with other female relatives of Confederate guerrillas inside a makeshift jail in Kansas City. And on August 13th, 1863, that building collapsed, killed several women, and seriously injured others.
Damn it.
Confederate guerrillas believed Union authorities had deliberately weakened the building, and the collapse helped fuel the old Lawrence, Kansas massacre.
Yeah.
Cole rode with Quantrill's men and took part in that raid, where approximately 150 men and boys were killed. Later served with old Bloody Bill Anderson, too, and continued fighting as a guerrilla until the Confederacy collapsed.
And what are you going to do?
Just like the old James boys, Cole emerged from the war with a cavalry experience, family grievances, and a Confederate identity, and connections to armed men who knew how to survive through secrecy, speed, and community support.
Damn right.
Missouri, they didn't suddenly just become peaceful when the army surrendered.
No.
Former guerrillas returned to communities where neighbors remembered exactly what side every family had supported.
No. Yeah.
Revenge killings continued, while the state placed political restrictions on former Confederates and required loyalty oaths before men could even vote, hold office, or enter certain professions.
Yep.
Those restrictions were eventually weakened or overturned, but they reinforced the belief among many Confederates that the war against them had never ended.
No, of course not.
Same men who had ridden together during the fighting still knew where to find horses, weapons, shelter, information, and sympathetic families willing to keep quiet. Those networks now became the foundation of organized robbery.
Man.
February 13th, 1866, armed men entered the Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri, stole roughly $60,000 in cash and bonds, killed college student George Wymore during their escape. Former guerrillas connected to the Archie Clement, they were suspected. Frank and old Jesse plus Cole and several future gang members were later linked to the robbery themselves.
Okay.
However, though, the evidence placing the James and Younger brothers inside the bank is weak.
Yeah, you can't do it.
The same uncertainty surrounds several early crimes attributed to them as well. Everybody wants to attribute to them when it's all said and done. Once mass horsemen begin robbing Missouri banks, newspapers and authorities attached.
Matter of fact, more people than not said that those guys weren't there.
Right. Well, you get these guys being famous and other banks start getting robbed and they just attach their names to them.
Yep.
What's clear, though, is that the former bushwhackers continue operating in armed groups after the war. They approached without warning, overwhelmed their targets, escaped on horseback, disappeared among relatives and Confederate neighbors unwilling to cooperate with the law. By the end of the 60s, old Frank and Jesse, they were becoming central figures within that world. And the loose collection of former guerrillas eventually became known as the James Younger Gang.
Okay.
Its membership changed from one robbery to another, but old Frank, Jesse, Cole, Jim, John, and Bob Younger, plus she had Clell, Miller, Charlie Pitts, and other men from the same Confederate network appeared repeatedly around it. Oh, Charlie Pitts. Their robberies relied on methods learned during the war. Lookouts controlled the street while other men entered the target. Escape routes and fresh horses were arranged ahead of time. Familiar terrain helped them avoid posses, while relatives and former Confederate supporters provided food, shelter, warnings, and places to hide.
Damn right.
That would be shelter.
Mm-hmm.
Difference was in what they were doing with those methods. They were no longer attacking Union troops or military supply lines, not no more. They're now stealing money from banks, express companies, stagecoaches, railroads, anywhere they can get it from.
Right.
Jesse, he worked hard to hide that distinction by presenting the gang's crimes as an extension of the Confederate struggle. I'm doing this because we were wronged.
The lost cause.
He found a powerful ally in old John Newman Edwards, who was a former Confederate officer himself, plus a newspaper editor who had served with General Joseph Shelby.
Fuck yeah.
Edwards, he wanted Missouri's former Confederates remembered as honorable men, resisting Northern occupation.
Okay.
And he transformed Jesse into a symbol of that cause. Letters and editorials presented the Outlaws as persecuted veterans striking back against Republican politicians, powerful banks, and the Northern-controlled railroads.
Big government.
Right. Jesse denied certain crimes, condemned the Republican Party. Plus, he claimed former Confederates were being falsely accused because of their wartime loyalties.
Oh,
maybe that happened a little bit.
I'm sure.
Result, it was the image of Jesse James as a Southern Robin Hood, even though there's no reliable evidence that he gave anything to the poor.
Right.
Robberies produced personal profit, but the Confederate story gave the gang something almost as valuable as money. Got communities willing to admire them, defend them, and refuse to help anyone hunting them. That protection worked until the gang traveled too far from home.
Yeah, can't do that.
September 7th, 1876, 8 members rode into Northfield, Minnesota. That's way up there, boys.
Yeah.
They intended to rob the First National Bank. 3 men entered the bank while the others guarded the street. The cashier, Joseph Lee Haywood, he refused to open the safe. It's on a time lock, brother.
Yep.
Outside, townspeople realized what was happening, grabbed rifles and shotguns, and opened fire from windows, doorways, and the street. The gang, they killed Haywood and Swedish immigrant Nikolaus Gustafsson, but escaped with almost nothing.
Idiots.
Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell, they were killed in town.
You're going to have some casualties.
Frank and Jesse, they escaped Minnesota, but Cole, Jim, and Bob, they were all wounded and captured after Charlie Pitts was killed during the final fight with a posse.
Damn.
Northfield destroyed the original James Younger gang because the men had left behind the relationships and friendly territory that had protected them since the war.
Yeah, dumbasses.
Without Missouri's hiding places, relatives, and Confederate supporters, they were just simply armed bank robbers trapped in a town that fought back.
Mm-hmm.
Cole Younger and the James brothers, they carried their wartime methods, grievances, loyalties, and personal feuds directly into the post-war world. They claimed the Confederate cause still lived through them, but Northfield stripped all that away.
Right.
And all they became was an outlaw gang chasing money hundreds of miles from home.
Yep.
Poor guys.
Bunch of assholes.
Greedy fuckers.
Right. Wild Bill.
Wild Bill.
Wild Bill Hickok.
It's almost around the anniversary of when this dude was killed.
He came out of the same violent Missouri and Kansas border country as the James brothers, but he carried his wartime experience in a very different direction. He's
one of the good ones.
He was born James Butler Hickok in Illinois. He moved to Kansas Territory during the 1850s, became involved with the anti-slavery free state movement. Before the Civil War, he worked as a constable, a stage driver, a teamster, a freight wagon employee. He gained experience with horses, weapons, long-distance travel, and the supply routes running all across the plains. When the war began, Hickok worked for the Union rather than joining a conventional regiment and remaining with it through a series of major battles. His jobs changed as the military needed him. He serves as a teamster and wagon master, carried messages as a courier, guided troops through unfamiliar country. He gathered info as a scout, performed intelligence and detective work all around Springfield, Missouri. Hickok, he knew the border country. He understood how armed groups moved through it, and he could operate alone in places where Confederate troops and guerrillas remain active. That later allowed writers to turn him into a master spy who repeatedly entered Confederate camps in elaborate disguises, uncovered secret plans. He killed enormous numbers of enemy soldiers.
That's what they say.
Yeah. Hickok may have crossed enemy lines and gathered intelligence, but most of the dramatic undercover adventures appeared after he became famous, and they can never be confirmed. His real wartime record, it was dangerous enough without them. He worked in a region where couriers could be ambushed, scouts usually captured and killed, supply trains were attacked, and a stranger's loyalty questioned by either side, right? Anybody coming in, it's low.
What's your motives, boy?
Right. By the end of the war, Hickok had learned how to read dangerous situations, how to track movement across open country. He even learned how to handle military supplies, investigate suspicious activity. Anybody knew how to do that.
Well,
and function where government authority depended heavily on the nerve and the judgment of individual men. And those skills followed him directly into the post-war West. On July 21st, 1865, only months after the fighting ended, Hickok, he faced gambler Davis Tutt across the public square in Springfield. The argument, simple, involved gambling debts and a gold watch that Tutt had taken as security.
yeah, you can't be flaunting around town,
Right.
buddy.
After Tut wore the watch in public, despite Hickok's warning not to, the two men met in the square. They drew their revolvers and fired from roughly 75 yards apart. Tut, he missed. Hickok, he doesn't. Shot him through the chest, killed him.
Dead.
Jury that later accepted that Hickok had acted in self-defense. But the unusual face-to-face gunfight gave the country one of its earliest famous gunfighter stories. Old Wild Bill Hickok returned to military work as the Army pushed farther onto the plains. He scouted in Kansas. He worked around forts and cavalry units. He carried prisoners. Damn, that's going to get heavy. Prisoners.
Can we get a wagon?
Right. He tracked hostile groups, and he served as alongside both white and black soldiers, including the 10th Cavalry. He also received work as a deputy United States Marshal, once again placing him in the uncertain space between military scout, detective, and frontier cop. Year of 1869, he became sheriff of Ellis County and marshal of Hays City, which is in Kansas. This is where he killed 2 men during their separate confrontations. 1871, he became marshal of Abilene. A cattle town crowded with armed cowboys, gamblers, saloon owners, and drovers arriving after months of on the trail. Hickok's rep, well, it probably prevented some trouble because few men wanted to test him.
Fastest gun in the West, baby.
But he was never the flawless peace officer created by later stories.
So they say.
His appointments were brief. Complaints followed his shootings. And town leaders sometimes decided that the famous gunfighter brought nearly as much danger as he controlled. That became painfully clear in Abilene. This is when Hickok shot and killed saloon owner Phil Coe.
Yeah, Phil Coe.
Then he turned and accidentally killed his own special deputy.
Yeah, that's what got him. He said, boy, you got to get out of this town.
Mike Williams. He was rushing in to help, and Hickok thought he was getting attacked from the back. Hickok lost the marshal's position before the end of the year. His lawman career over. But his reputation continued to grow through newspaper stories and stage appearances with his best bud, Buffalo Bill and Texas Jack. By the time Hickok reached Deadwood in 1876, his eyesight was declining. Years of gambling had left him far removed from the confident Union scout of the 1860s. And on the 2nd of August, Jack McCall walked behind him during a poker game. After the night before, or actually a couple hours before, after Hickok embarrassed him in front of everybody in the bar.
Here, go buy lunch.
Right.
He said, oh, how insulting.
When Wild Bill walked into that tavern, his usual seat was already taken next to the wall. So he decided what no gunfighter ever does, to sit with his back against the door. And that's what killed him, because Jack McCall walked in, shot him in the back of the head, dead. Hickok and James brothers had emerged from the same border conflict. This is where formal authority was weak and survival often depended on weapons, knowledge, personal alliances. Frank and Jesse, they carried the rebel guerrilla methods. Hickok carried Union scout intelligence work and military experience into his Army service and lawmanship. He represented the other path a man could take out of that war. Although the line separating lawman from gunfighter was never as clean as the legend later made it appear.
Some could argue some of the lawmen were indeed outlaws themselves.
Yeah.
Which a lot of them might have been.
That's the biggest thing with Wyatt Earp.
Right. He was both, though, at various times.
Yeah.
Legitimately. Let's take a look at old Buffalo Bill, what he did. Long before old William F. Cody became Buffalo Bill, he grew up inside that same political violence that helped tear the country apart. His family, they moved to Kansas Territory in 1854 while pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers, they were fighting over its future already. Cody's father, Isaac, he publicly opposed extending slavery into Kansas. During a meeting at Rively's Trading Post, a pro-slavery settler stabbed him twice with a knife, leaving wounds that damaged his health and contributed to his death in 1857. Cody, he was only 11, soon went to work helping support the family. In later autobiographies, he filled these years with dangerous rides, scouting missions, and adventures with the Pony Express. Several of those stories can't be confirmed because we already know old Buffalo Bill was a notorious imaginator.
Yeah. Exaggerator.
Right. Yeah, there you go. An imaginator, right?
Sure.
His Civil War service, it's much clearer, though. February 19th, 1864, he enlisted as a private in Company H of the 7th Kansas Cavalry. He was 17. All those enlistment papers listed him as 18. The regiment, they served in Tennessee, Mississippi, Missouri, and Arkansas during the closing portion of the war. Scouting, patrolling, guarding railroads, pursuing guerrillas, and protecting military routes. Cody, he didn't command any troops or perform the spectacular secret missions later attached to his name. He did serve as cavalry private and was mustered out in September of 1865. That experience gave him military discipline and practical knowledge of horses, weapons, patrols, and movement through dangerous country. Skills that immediately remained useful after the war. He soon found work as civilian scout for the Army, and why not just stay in the Army, bud?
Right.
1867 began hunting buffalo to supply meat to crews building the Kansas Pacific Railroad. His success in that job earned him the name Buffalo Bill, although another hunter named Bill Comstock also claimed it. Well, I want to be Buffalo Bill. Well, we can both be Buffalo Bills.
I guarantee you there's probably dozens.
There's Buffalo Bills, there's Buffalo Tims, there's Buffalo...
when was the Buffalo Massacre? 70s?
Right now?
Yeah. So, yeah.
There's Buffalo Steve. Cody, he reportedly settled the argument by defeating Comstock in a hunting contest. He supposedly killed 68 buffalo to Comstock's 48. Why?
Right.
1868, Cody returned to the Army work as a scout, a guide, and dispatch rider, eventually becoming chief of scouts for the 5th Cavalry. Nice. April 26, 1872, he displayed what the Army described simply as gallantry in action near the Loop Fork of the Platte River in Nebraska, and he received the Medal of Honor for it. Wow.
Yeah.
Because Cody was serving as a civilian scout, the award was removed from the official rolls and during the Broad Review in 1917, but then was restored once again in 1989.
When it doesn't make a fucking difference.
Right. Well, at least he got it when he was alive, though.
Right.
By the time he received it, however, the real scout was already becoming a fictional hero. Writer Ned Buntline, he placed Buffalo Bill at the center of dime novels that exaggerated his adventures and presented him as the ideal frontier fighter.
If you got some dime novels made after you, buddy, you're a pretty popular guy.
Cody, he understood the value of the image, too. December of 1872, he joined Texas Jack Omohundro and Buntline on stage in Chicago in the Scouts of the Prairie, where he played an excited version of himself for paying audiences.
Nice.
The critics thought his acting was terrible, but the crowds loved him. What Cody carried out of the... Well, hey, I guess all that kind of critic shit still continues to this day.
You're turbo acting like yourself.
Right, right. What Cody did carry out of the Civil War was more than cavalry experience. He understood that scouting, danger, military service, buffalo hunting, and frontier violence could be shaped into a heroic story. Old Buffalo Bill became the man who connected the real Civil War generation to the manufactured legend of the Wild West.
There you go.
Mm-mm.
There you go. John Omohundro, they call him Texas Jack. He may be the clearest example of the Civil War and the Wild West becoming part of the same story. He was born in Virginia, 1846. Only 14 when the war began, reportedly tried more than once to join his brother in the Confederate service. He was rejected because of his age, but later accounts say that he was allowed to carry messages from Virginia militia under John B. Floyd. Those early courier stories are often difficult to confirm through surviving military records, and they were repeated after Texas Jack became famous. What are you going to do? So they have to be treated carefully. His formal Confederate service is much better documented because on 15th February 1864, 17 years old, Omohundro, he enlisted as a private in Company G of the 5th Virginia Cavalry. The regiment served with the Army of Northern Virginia's cavalry and operated under old Jeb Stuart's command. Omohundro, his skill as a horseman and his knowledge of the Virginia countryside reportedly led to work as a courier and a scout. The most famous story from this period claims that he completed a scouting mission and delivered information to Stuart shortly before the general was mortally wounded at Yellow Tavern on 11th of May, 1864. That may have happened, but the story comes largely from later family accounts and biographies rather than a detailed wartime report, so it cannot be presented with complete certainty. What is certain, though, is that Omohundro, he was serving in Stuart's cavalry during the campaign that ended with Stuart's death. 1 month later, the 5th Virginia Cavalry, it fought at Trevelyan Station. This is where Union and Confederate cavalry collided in one of the largest all-cavalry battles of the war. Omohundro, he was wounded during the fighting, and he was admitted to a Confederate hospital in Charlottesville on the 20th of June. After recovering and receiving a short leave, he returned to duty. He continued serving during the Shenandoah Valley campaigns, first under General Lunsford Lomax, and then later within cavalry commanded by Fitzhugh Lee. By the time the old rebel collapsed in 1865, Omohundro, he was only 18, but he had already experienced scouting, courier work, cavalry combat, and defeat. With the war over and few opportunities waiting for him in Virginia, he went south and eventually reached Texas. This is where he worked as a cowboy, a trail guide, cattle driver, and he puts the horsemanship and outdoor skills he had used during the war to work in a new setting. During a cattle drive through Arkansas, toward Tennessee, he acquired the name Texas Jack. And by 1869, he had moved north to Kansas and Nebraska. This is where he met old Wild Bill and became close friends with Buffalo Bill. Cody helped him obtain work as a trail guide and civilian scout with the 5th United States Cavalry. Later accounts claim special permission was required because the federal government was reluctant to employ a former Confederate.
I bet.
The exact policy and circumstances, not clear, but his Confederate background reportedly complicated his hiring. The result carried enormous symbolic weight, whether anyone recognized it or not at that time. A man who had scouted for the Confederate cavalry was now guiding United States troops across the plains alongside Union veterans. Texas Jack and Buffalo Bill, they worked together as scouts and hunting guides. They led wealthy visitors and military officers into the West. Their friendship eventually carried them somewhere neither man could have ever expected during the war.
Yeah, in Chicago.
Right. They went to Chicago and Ned Buttline's production of The Scouts and Prairie, as we said. The acting was rough. The audiences loved seeing these genuine performers. The following year, Wild Bill, he joined Cody and Alejandro in a new production called Scouts of the Plains. Hickok had worked for the Union during the war. Cody had served in the 7th Kansas Cavalry. Texas Jack had ridden with the 5th Virginia Cavalry. And less than 10 years after they had belonged to the opposing sides, all three were standing together before cheering crowds. This helped create the heroic public image of the Wild West. Oh, Texas Jack. He carried Confederate cavalry experience, horsemanship, scouting ability, and adaptability required to survive defeat into his Western life. He didn't simply exchange one uniform for another. He transformed the useful parts of his wartime identity into work as a cowboy, guide, a federal scout, and an entertainer. Loosely.
Right.
His story provides the perfect central image for this kind of crossover. A former Confederate cavalryman standing beside former Union men as yesterday's enemies turned their real experiences into America's Wild West legend.
Texas Jack, huh? Well, now we get to a man that was already famous before the Civil War began and throughout the Civil War. Oh, Kit Carson. Like we said, he didn't have to reinvent himself in the West because he was already one of the most famous frontiers in America before the war began. He was a trapper, a guide, a scout, a rancher, and federal Indian agent. Newspaper stories and dime novels turned him into a frontier hero far greater than the real man. When Confederate forces invaded New Mexico territory, Carson accepted a Union commission and became colonel of the largely Hispanic 1st New Mexico Volunteers. The Confederate campaign was led by Brigadier General Henry Hopkins Sibley. He hoped to seize New Mexico, capture its military supplies, and open a path towards Colorado and maybe even California. February 21st, 1862, Sibley's Texans, they met Colonel Edward Canby's Union force near Fort Craig at the Battle of Valverde. Carson's regiment, they crossed the Rio Grande and entered the fight as part of a Union army containing thousands of Hispanic volunteers and militiamen. During that battle, his men fired into a Confederate cavalry charge and helped break it apart. When some Anglo officers criticized the performance of the New Mexican troops afterwards, Carson, he defended them. He reported they had advanced under fire, driven back the Confederate charge, and obeyed orders during their first major battle. What more do you want from them?
Right.
He later wrote that when properly led, their courage was unquestionable. So you had to lead them like some dogs or something.
Right.
Confederates eventually broke the Union line, captured 6 artillery pieces, and forced Canby's army back into Fort Craig. Valverde was a tactical Confederate victory, but Sibley could not capture the fort or its supplies. His army continued north, occupied Albuquerque and Santa Fe before losing most of its remaining supply train during the Battle of Glorieta Pass in March.
Uh-oh.
Starving and exhausted and unable to support the campaign, the old Confederate allies, they retreated back to Texas.
Oh, wow.
Their attempt to carry the Civil War into the Southwest failed. Once the threat collapsed, the same Union troops and military resources were redirected towards native peoples.
Of course.
All right, who else can we fuck up? Under orders from Brigadier General James Carson, he led campaigns against the Mescalero Apache and then the Navajo. These conflicts had begun long before the Civil War and would continue long after, and they grew from decades of raids, retaliation, settlement, competition over land and livestock, and broken agreements, most importantly.
Yeah.
Civil War didn't create them, but it placed Carson and thousands of volunteers inside an expanded federal military system that could pursue them more aggressively.
Okay.
Carleton, he intended to force the Mescalero and Navajo onto a reservation at Bosque Redondo near Fort Sumner. Carson initially resisted parts of the assignment, briefly attempted to resign, but he ultimately carried out Carleton's orders.
Yeah, might as well.
His troops destroyed crops, orchards, food stores, homes, livestock, attacking the resources native families needed to remain in their homeland.
Jeez.
During the Navajo campaign, Carson's men entered Canyon de Chelly and continued the scorched earth strategy until hunger and exposure forced thousands to surrender. Beginning in 1864, Navajo captives were marched hundreds of miles under military guard to Bosque Redondo in what became known as the Long Walk.
Yep.
People died along the way from hunger, sickness, exhaustion, exposure, and violence. And there at the Redondo, the land could not reliably support thousands of the Navajo and Mescalero prisoners confined there.
Of course not.
Crops, they failed, water was poor, disease spread, and food and shelter remained inadequate. The Mescalero eventually escaped, while the Navajo, they endured the reservation until 1868 treaty allowed them to return to part of their homeland. Carson's story proves the Civil War and the Wild West were never separate worlds unfolding one after the other. Those same federal officers, forts, volunteers, weapons, supply lines, and military authority used to defeat the Confederates, they remained in place after the immediate threat was gone.
Right.
Without any real interruption, that machinery turned towards Western expansion and forced the removal of the natives. Carson did not carry the Civil War into new Western life. His life did show that the Civil War had reached the West, while the conquest of the West was already underway.
Oh, wow. Crazy shit.
Wasn't he involved in something that Fremont did in California where they massacred a bunch of people too? I'm pretty sure.
Sounds familiar. Ben Thompson. He spent his adult life moving back and forth between organized authority and personal violence. The Civil War gave him his first real experience doing both with a gun in his hand. He was born in England, raised in Austin. Well, that's weird. Thompson enlisted into the Army on the 16th of June, 1861, in Colonel John Ford's 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles. They call him RIP. Later known as the 2nd Texas Cavalry. Much of his early service was spent in Texas, but on the 1st of January, 1863, he took part in the Confederate attack that recaptured Galveston. Union forces that occupied the city controlled the harbor, but the Confederate troops under Major General John B. Magruder, he launched a coordinated attack by land and water. Soldiers attacked through the streets, while Confederate gunboats, including the Bayou City, challenged the Union ships offshore. The Bayou City rammed and boarded the U.S. Harriet Lane, whose crew surrendered after a brutal close-range fight. Another Union ship, the USS Westfield, was destroyed by its own crew after running aground. And the remaining Union vessels, they said, we got to get the hell out of here. Thompson, he was wounded, but recovered and returned to service. Later that year, he fought at the La Fourche crossing in Louisiana. This is where Confederate troops attacked a Union position near Thibodaux, but they were driven back. Thompson returned back to Austin in November of 1863 to marry Catherine Moore, and then he reenlisted and remained in Confederate service until the end of the war. May of 1865, after the Confederacy had collapsed, he killed a teamster during an argument over an army mule. Federal soldiers, they arrested him, but Thompson escaped custody and crossed into Mexico. According to later accounts, he entered the army of Emperor Maximilian, the Austrian ruler, placed on the Mexican throne with French support. And he received promotions for bravery before Maximilian's government fell in 1867. Thompson, he returned back to Texas, already comfortable with military discipline, armed confrontation, and living his own judgment when formal authority stood in his way. He became a professional gambler and a saloon owner, occupations that repeatedly placed him around alcohol, money, weapons, and dangerous men. In Abilene, Kansas, he opened the Bull's Head Saloon with Phil Cole and encountered both Wild Bill and John Wesley Hardin. Oh, John Wesley Hardin, nice. Thompson and Hickok disliked one another, but despite the later stories of an approaching showdown, the two men, they never fought. Thompson later became friends with Bat Masterson, and he worked beside him as a hired gun during a railroad dispute in Colorado. He could move naturally among soldiers, cops, gamblers, gunfighters, and hired enforcers, and the threat of immediate violence. Austin voters elected him city marshal in December of 1880, and they reelected him again the following year. And by most surviving accounts, Thompson was remarkably effective. He knew the city. He understood its gamblers and saloon crowds. He possessed a reputation that made many men reconsider causing trouble. Citizens who knew him as a gunfighter also praised his honesty, his loyalty, and his refusal to tolerate crooked gambling. Yet, becoming marshal did not erase the private side of his life. July 1882, still in office, Thompson went to Vaudeville Theater in San Antonio during a feud with its owner, Jack Harris. Harris appeared with a shotgun and Thompson killed him. He ended up resigning as marshal. He stood trial for the murder, but he was acquitted. Austin welcomed him home again, but Harris's friends did not forget. Because on 11th of March, 1884, Thompson returned to the Vaudeville Theater with gunfighter and former sheriff King Fisher. The two men were led into an upstairs theater box and suddenly hit by gunfire from behind and from an adjoining box. Both men were murdered, and no one was ever charged. Thompson had carried battlefield experience, confidence with weapons, and the ability to function inside organized authority out of the Civil War. Those qualities made him an effective soldier and a marshal, but he never abandoned the feuds and armed confrontations of the gunfighter world. And in the end, the private violence he had repeatedly survived reached him inside the very kind of public place he had once been elected to control.
Why would you go back to the very theater that you killed the dude
Right.
at? Just, come on, guy.
That's stupid.
Well, then we have Dallas Staudenmeyer. He arrived in El Paso with exactly the kind of reputation the town believed it needed. Born in Alabama, 1845, he was still a teenager when he entered Confederate service in 1862. The surviving record of his military career contains gaps. Later accounts disagree over the units in which he served, but records connect a Dallas Staudenmeyer to Alabama infantry and cavalry commands.
Okay.
He reportedly suffered several wounds before the war ended. Whatever the precise details of his service, he emerged from the Civil War experienced with weapons and unusually calm when men began shooting around him. Staudenmeyer, he moved to Texas after the war, briefly served with the Texas Rangers in 1874, and eventually became a marshal of Socorro, New Mexico. April 1881, El Paso, they hired him as town marshal after cycling through 5 other marshals in approximately 8 months.
Damn.
Growing border town, that's why. They needed someone capable of confronting cattle thieves, gamblers, drunks, and armed feuds. And old Staudenmeyer, he appeared to be the man for the job. 3 days after taking that job, he became part of the gunfight that defined his own legend.
Uh-oh.
Trouble began after 2 Mexican vaqueros, were searching for stolen cattle. They were found murdered outside El Paso. A large army party crossed from Mexico to recover their bodies and attend the investigation, creating tension among local residents. Constable Gus Krempkau, who spoke Spanish, he assisted during the inquest. Afterward, Krempkau, he entered the saloon and argued with former Marshal George Campbell over accusations that he had sided with the Mexicans.
Oh.
A drunken cattleman named John Hale, he grabbed one of Campbell's pistols and shot Krempkau.
Oh, shit.
Staudenmeyer, he was eating across the street when he heard the gunfire, rushed outside with his pistols drawn and fired while moving, but his first bullet struck and killed an innocent Mexican bystander.
Dumbass.
He then shot Hale, reportedly hit him in the head.
Oh.
The wounded Krempkau, believing Campbell had been involved in shooting him, fired at Campbell before collapsing him.
Oh, no.
One bullet struck Campbell's gun and wrist, while another hit his foot. Campbell attempted to recover his weapon, and Staudenmeyer shot him. Krempkau and Campbell both died.
Oh.
The entire confrontation became known as the 4 dead in 5 seconds gunfight, although the exact link was never established and the polished name came later. Staudenmeyer, he did kill 3 of the 4 men, including one completely innocent person.
Yeah, what are you going to do?
The shooting made him famous and demonstrated the contradiction at the center of his career. He possessed the battlefield ability to react immediately under fire, identify threats, and kill armed opponents before they could respond. He also opened fire in a crowded street and killed a bystander.
Yeah, what are you going to do?
Wasn't clean, controlled justice, but justice nonetheless, I guess.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
It was battlefield violence that applied to a town filled with civilians. Staudenmeyer's actions created enemies almost as quickly as they created his reputation, too.
Yeah.
3 days later, after the shooting, former Deputy Marshal Bill Johnson waited behind a pile of bricks with a shotgun intended to ambush him.
Whoa, what a bitch.
Johnson lost his balance and accidentally discharged both barrels without hitting his target.
Oh, my gosh.
Staudenmeyer immediately returned fire and killed him.
That's what you get for being a dumbass.
Well, that incident, though, pulled him into a feud with the powerful Manning family, whose members had been friendly with Hale and Campbell. The feud became even more personal February of 1882 when James Manning shot and killed Staudenmeyer's brother-in-law, Stanley Cummins. They called him Doc.
Oh, no.
And then was acquitted for claiming self-defense.
Oh, jeez.
Staudenmeyer, he was an effective marshal, but his heavy drinking, violent temper, and public threats increasingly frightened the same people who'd hired him. El Paso officials attempted to remove him May of 1882. Staudenmeyer reportedly entered a council meeting drunk and challenged the alderman to take his guns or his position. Which one?
Right. What you going to do?
The council backed down temporarily, but he resigned soon after and became Deputy United States Marshal.
Nope. Fuck it.
The change in title did nothing to end the Manning feud, though. September 18th, 1882, Staudenmeyer met James and Doc Manning in an El Paso saloon during an attempt to settle their differences. Get a little sit-down, Old West style.
Yeah.
An argument erupted, guns were drawn, and Doc Manning wounded Staudenmeyer.
Oh.
Staudenmeyer returned fire and hit Doc in the arm, but James Manning shot Staudenmeyer from behind, striking him in the head and killing him.
Oh, shit.
Damn. He was only 36 years old. Staudenmeyer carried the Confederate military experience into the West, used it to impose order with extraordinary speed and nerve. At that very same time, he showed how easily a veteran lawman could become part of the violence he was supposed to control. El Paso hired him because he knew how to act like a soldier in the middle of gunfire. In the end, the town discovered what a man who brought the battlefield into its streets could be both its strongest defense and one of its greatest dangers.
Yeah, that's insane, man. What are you going to do?
Crazy.
What you going to do? Clay Allison. He was one of the Wild West's most famous unpredictable gunfighters. But the documented man is difficult to separate from the stories that gathered around him. He was born in Tennessee, year of 1841. Allison enlisted in Captain W.H. Jackson's Confederate Artillery Battery on the 15th of October. This first period of service lasted only a few months. Army doctors discharged him in January of 1862 after describing him as a partly epileptic and partly maniacal.
Oh, wow.
Oh, this dude's
Crazy.
insane. That language that has encouraged later writers to diagnose Allison from a distance. Some accounts connect his condition to an earlier head injury, but the surviving evidence does not even allow anyone to say exactly what was wrong with him or even explain his later behavior through a modern diagnosis. What is clear, Allison wanted to return to war. 22nd of September, 1862, he reenlisted in the 9th Tennessee Cavalry, served within the Confederate Cavalry Forces commanded by Nathan Bedford Forrest. He remained with that regiment until Forrest's command surrendered at Gainesville, Alabama, in May of 1865.
Wow.
Unlike the James brothers, Allison did not emerge from guerrilla warfare with an existing outlaw network. He came west as a conventional Confederate cavalry veteran, accustomed to horses, weapons, danger, and sudden violence. After the war, he worked with cattle in Texas and eventually reached Colfax County in New Mexico. This is where he established a successful ranch near Cimarron. The region was already caught in bitter disputes over land, political power, and control of the enormous Maxwell land grant. We did an episode on that.
Sure did.
Allison became involved with local settlers and vigilantes, who believed formal authorities either could not or would not protect them. 1870, he helped lead a mob that dragged Charles Kennedy from jail in Elizabethtown and hanged him after Kennedy was accused of murdering several travelers. The famous story says that Allison cut off Kennedy's head and carried it to Cimarron. May have grown from the truth, but its mostly dramatic details are difficult to prove. Allison was later connected to additional lynchings and shootings during the Colfax County War. He killed gunman Chunk Colbert during a confrontation in 1874. Although the polished story that the two men calmly ate dinner before Colbert tried shooting him contains details added by later storytellers.
Well, obviously.
Right. 1875, Allison was accused of helping lynch Cruz Vega, a suspect in the murder of Reverend Franklin Tolby. Days later, Vega's uncle, Francisco Grego, he confronted Allison inside the Lambert Inn. Grego reached for his pistol, and Allison said no, shot him twice. Authorities eventually accepted Allison's claim of self-defense. And in December of 1876, Allison and his brother John exchanged gunfire with Constable Charles Faber and two deputies in Los Animas. This is in Colorado. After refusing to surrender their weapons, John wounded, Faber killed. Charges against the brothers were dismissed after witnesses concluded that the constable's group had fired first. Story, isn't that weird? Nowadays, if the cops fired first, they're
Who
not,
gives a shit, right?
Right.
You had a gun.
Right. Right. Stories also placed Allison in knife fights, saloon rampages, range disputes, and supposed confrontations with men such as Wyatt Earp. But many appeared years afterward and cannot be trusted completely.
Mm-hmm.
I doubt it. The legend presented him as a dangerous but honorable man who killed only when provoked. The record shows something less comfortable. A successful rancher and Confederate veteran who could be friendly and generous, and then become violent, reckless, or deeply threatening at any moment. Civil War cannot be blamed for every shooting, lynching, or drunken outburst connected to Allison. It would be dishonest to claim that the military service created whatever personal problems he had.
He's just a fucking psycho, man.
Right. What the war did provide was years of cavalry experience before releasing another armed young veteran into a Western country where weak authority, land disputes, vigilante justice rewarded men willing to use violence. Allison survived that world only to die in an ordinary accident in 1887. He fell from a supply wagon and was crushed beneath its wheel.
Oh, no. Probably ran over his head.
Damn. His later grave marker called him a gentleman gunfighter, while another added the perfect final line to the mythology. It said, he never killed a man that did not need killing. Okay. By then, the complicated veteran had disappeared beneath the Western legend.
Oh. All right, well, that takes us to John Wesley Hardin and people like him who had never served in the Civil War.
No.
See, he was only 7 when it began and 12 when it ended, but it didn't mean he escaped its influence. Hardin represented the generation raised inside the conflict and released into the violence that followed it. Born in Bonham, Texas, May 26, 1853, he was the son of James Gibson Hardin, a Methodist preacher, a teacher, a lawyer, a slaveholder, and plus a strong supporter of the old Confederates. John, he grew up hearing the Southern cause defended from the pulpit and inside his own home.
Oh, wow.
He watched Texas send men to war. He watched Texas send men to war, endure Confederate defeat, and then enter Reconstruction under federal military authority.
Oh, wow.
Formerly enslaved people gained freedom and political rights. Federal troops remained in the state, and a new Texas state police force attempted to reinforce Reconstruction laws.
Yeah, good luck.
Many white former Confederates viewed those changes as foreign rule imposed by armed occupiers. Fuck you, Texas, dude. You guys have not changed your views for over 150 years, dude.
No.
Political resistance, racial hatred, personal feuds, and ordinary crime became tangled together, creating exactly the kind of world in which a violent young man could imagine himself as both a fugitive and a defender of his community. Hardin's violent career began with a schoolyard fight in 1867 when he stabbed another boy.
Ooh.
The following year, at age 15, he shot and killed a formerly enslaved man named Mage.
Oh.
Hardin, he later claimed Mage had attacked him with a stick after an earlier wrestling match and that he fired in self-defense. Regardless if that happened or not, Hardin knew that Reconstruction authorities would pursue him, so he fled rather than face an investigation.
Right.
He later claimed that 3 Union soldiers came after him and that he ambushed and killed all 3.
Oh, okay.
No independent evidence confirms the story, and much of what is known about Hardin's early life comes from the autobiography he wrote years later while trying to defend his reputation. Even when the individual details can't be trusted, the way Hardin told the story is pretty revealing.
Right.
He cast himself as a Southern boy hunted by federal soldiers and Reconstruction authorities, turning the killing that made him a fugitive into another chapter of the Confederacy's unfinished struggle.
Right.
But what about them?
Right.
Hardin continued killing as he moved through Texas, worked cattle drives, gambled, and attached himself to armed relatives and allies. His reputation brought protection in communities where former Confederates distrusted the state police, federal troops, and the Republican officials pursuing him.
All right.
He became involved with the Taylor side of the Sutton-Taylor feud, another conflict in which family revenge and Reconstruction politics fed years of murder. 1871, he drove cattle north to Abilene, where he encountered the old famous Wild Bill Hickok.
Nice.
Hardin, he later claimed he once got the drop on Hickok by spinning his pistols into fire position while surrendering them. But Hardin was the only source for that famous story, and he wrote it after Hickok was dead.
Yeah, I bet he did.
What can be established that the two men did know each other, and Hickok tolerated Hardin until another killing forced him to flee Abilene.
Right.
So when he shot the guy snoring,
Yeah.
and then he was like, if Wild Bill catches me with my pants down, he'll kill me on the spot.
He sure will.
He was scared of Wild Bill.
He was scared.
He loved him too.
Yeah.
Hardin had now entered the same cattle town world, occupied by Civil War veterans such as Hickok, Ben Thompson, Texas Jack, but he arrived as something different. They carried the military experience into the West. Hardin, he carried the political anger, racial violence, and resistance to authority produced by the war's aftermath.
All right.
His fight, it continued till May 1874 when he killed Deputy Sheriff Charles Webb in Comanche, Texas. That murder created such an outrage that several of Hardin relatives and allies were arrested or lynched, while Hardin himself escaped with his wife and children and hid under an assumed name in Florida. Texas Rangers, they finally found him aboard a train in Pensacola, August of 1877. Ranger John B. Armstrong and the officers with him confronted Hardin as he attempted to draw a pistol, subdued him, and returned him back to Texas.
Damn right.
He was convicted of Webb's murder, sentenced to 25 years in prison.
Damn.
During his confinement, Hardin studied law, taught Sunday school, and attempted to rebuild himself as an educated and reformed man.
All right.
He was released 1894 after serving nearly 17 years.
That's nice.
Received a pardon, passed the bar, and tried to establish a legal practice. Transformation didn't last. He then moved to El Paso, returned to gambling and drinking, became involved in another dispute surrounding a woman connected to one of his clients. August 1895, Constable John Selman entered the Acme Saloon and shot Hardin in the back of the head.
Oh, man.
Hardin was 42. Damn. The story expands the connection between the Civil War and the Wild West beyond the veterans who wore the uniforms.
Damn.
He inherited a defeated Confederate identity, hatred of Reconstruction authority, and a culture that allowed personal violence to be described as political resistance.
Right.
The old Civil War didn't teach John Wesley Hardin how to fight on a battlefield, but it did give him the broken and bitter world in which he learned to kill. Good Lord.
Poor guy. Well, the Civil War, it didn't create the American West. And it would be far too simple to claim that every outlaw, every gunfighter, every lawman, scout, or every Indian war came directly from 4 years of fighting between the Union and the Confederacy. Americans had been moving west long before Fort Sumter. Conflict over land, slavery, native sovereignty, and the border between the United States and Mexico was already tearing through the region. What the Civil War did was accelerate nearly everything. It trained millions of men to ride, to shoot, to scout, to follow trails, to guard supply lines, survive outdoors, and make their life or death decisions under pressure. It produced officers accustomed to commanding large forces and young soldiers who had spent their most important years surrounded by violence. It left enormous numbers of military weapons in circulation, released veterans into a country where many had no home, no job, or a peaceful life waiting for them. Some became farmers, railroad workers, businessmen, and local officials. Others became Army scouts, marshals, sheriffs, hired guns, vigilantes, or even outlaws. The skills were often the same, even when the badge, uniform, and purpose changed. At the same time, though, the federal government emerged from the war with greater military power, a national railroad policy, and a stronger determination to control the continent. Even while the fighting continued, Congress passed the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act, encouraging settlement and supporting the railroad that would connect the country from east to west, from sea to sea. Veterans and immigrants, they helped build those railroad lines, while military posts protected construction crews, settlers, mail routes, and commercial traffic. 1866, Congress created new army regiments that included the Black Soldiers, later known as the Buffalo Soldiers. Many of those men fought for the Union or gained their freedom because of the war. They were then sent west. This is where they guarded railroads. They built forts.
And then guarded them.
Right. They escorted travelers. They confronted outlaws and fought native people, resisting the loss of their land, right? Jeez. Former Union and Confederate soldiers could now find themselves living in the same towns, riding the same cattle trails, working the same railroads, or even standing on the upsides of another in a gunfight. The war also carried its unfinished bitterness westward. Missouri, Confederate guerrillas turned wartime hiding places, family networks, and hit-and-run tactics into the foundation of the James Younger Gang. Texas, the anger and racial violence of Reconstruction shaped the world inherited by Wesley Hardin. Former soldiers such as Ben Thompson, Dallas Stoudenmeyer, and Clay Allison, they entered communities where personal reputation sometimes carried more weight than legal authority. Some veterans, they used their wartime nerve to enforce the law. Others used it to defy the law. And more than a few moved between those roles depending on who was paying them or whom they believed had wronged them. Men such as Wild Bill, Buffalo Bill, and Texas Jack that carried the war in another direction. They turned real military experience into public entertainment, becoming heroic versions of themselves on stage and in print. The Wild West Americans came to recognize was not simply discovered on the plains. It was packaged and sold by men who understood that audiences wanted clean heroes, dangerous villains, brave scouts, savage enemies, and gunfights with obvious winners. The fucking, yeah, we always think these people are sick. It's the fucking people watching it. They're sick bastards. The complicated reality of civil war, guerrilla violence, conquest, racial conflict, and personal ambition became a national adventure story. Former enemies could stand together beneath stage lights because the show no longer required anyone to explain exactly what they had done during the war or whose cause had been right. A former Blue Coat scout, a former rebel cavalryman, a Kansas soldier, who all become Western heroes once their histories were folded into the same legend. That legend hid one of the darkest connections between the Civil War and the West. Once the Confederacy had been defeated, much of the federal military power used to preserve the Union could be redirected toward controlling Western land and forcing Native people to places they don't want to go. The forts, the supply systems, the scouts, the officers, the veteran soldiers remained available even after the Confederate armies disappeared. Kit Carson's career exposed that transition clearly. As we know, he fought Confederate invaders in New Mexico. He led campaigns that destroyed Navajo crops, homes, orchards, and livestock until thousands surrendered, and did that long walk to Bosque Redondo. The enemies changed. The machinery of war remained. That may be the most important answer to the question of how the Civil War shaped the Wild West. It did not create an entirely new world on the 9th of April, 1865 at the Appomattox Courthouse. No. It removed the dividing line Americans later placed between two historical eras, Civil War and the Wild West. They overlapped through the same men, weapons, horses, political grudges, military posts, and expanding government. The outlaw hiding in Missouri, the marshal walking in the El Paso saloon, the scout guiding cavalry across the plains, that black soldier guarding a western fort, the one-way railroad worker laying track, and that native family being forced from its homeland. They all lived inside the consequences of the same national transformation. The famous Wild West of Jesse James, Wild Bill, Buffalo Bill, Texas Jack, Kit Carson, Ben Thompson, Dallas Stoudenmeyer, Clay Allison, John Hardin. Not the story America began after finishing the Civil War. It was one of the places where the Civil War continued, only without the blue and gray battle lines that made it easier to recognize.
Yeah.
That's that.
That's that. The old Civil War shaping the old Wild Western War. Well, that was cool. Kind of a recap of people, but I mean, that's how. Yeah. See, Civil War did it. It did things, just like Phil Collins.
Yep. Fucking did it.
Fucking did it. That's gonna do it for us. This special crossover episode of Battles and Outlaws, Outlaws and Battles. You guys that are listening on the Outlaws feed, go, we do Civil War stuff. Just like this. Right. We got the battles, we got the generals, we got the regiments, we got sub battles, all that kind of stuff on this. Everything you really want from a Civil War podcast content, we got it over there. Battles of the American Civil War. And for you guys listening on the Battles of the American Civil War, we do outlaw stuff too, which is Wild West, like we just covered here. But we also got Mafia, we also got Prohibition, we got street gangs, we got biker gangs, we got all sorts of shit in between, serial killers, and all sorts of dark, sick, twisted shit over there. So you guys go do what you got to do. All the links will be in the description. Right. And yeah, we'll see you guys next week for your respective return to regularly scheduled programming. With that, we'll see you then where the mouth of Michigan is.